Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from the 1 Minute Apologist channel, so naturally it's only about 25 minutes long. In this video, they purport to explain 5 colossal biblical contradictions, and being a rather lengthy video, I will be skipping quite a bit of superfluous banter and a bit they do at the beginning about cancel culture, because nothing says canceled like complaining about the canceling of opposing viewpoints on a channel with almost 75,000 subscribers and just under 8 million views, am I right? Anyway, let's go!
When I became a Christian, I was looking to get 2 questions answered. What do I do with my guilt? What's the purpose of my life? And that gets answered in Jesus, right? He come to give us life abundantly. John 10:10. He eradicates our guilt on the cross.
Yeah. Those don't really answer the question. He gives us life abundantly would, if anything, be an answer to how much life do I get, not what do I do with my life. And him eradicating guilt on the cross is an immoral idea that can lead to immoral behavior. If you do something wrong, you don't need to seek forgiveness from the people that you have wronged. It's okay because Jesus died for you on the cross. No need to try and make it right. Jesus made it right for you. Now, I'm sure apologists will bring up the parts of the New Testament that talk about how faith without works is dead, and stuff like that implies that making amends with people you have wronged is important. But I'm equally sure that Jesus' sacrifice has provided plenty of people with a feeling of absolution that they did nothing to earn.
He had us reading the Synoptic Gospels, and that is where I really started feeling some tension myself, thinking, well, this account says this and this account says this, and I didn't know what to do with these apparent contradictions. Now, the difference between you and me, Tim, is we would say that these are apparent contradictions. You'll get some who say, no, there's literal contradictions.
And then you get people like me who ask, even if every single apparent contradiction in the Bible can somehow be reconciled, why is there even the appearance of contradiction in the perfect Word of God? Why would God choose to communicate using words that he knew would lead people away from him? But also, well, there are definitely some apparent contradictions that aren't actually contradictory when you learn about the context. There is a lot that are absolutely contradictions, like how Numbers 23:19 says that God is not a man that he should lie, which directly contradicts Ezekiel 14:9, which says that if a prophet is deceived, then I, the Lord, have deceived that prophet. He cannot deceive a prophet while also not lying.
But I think first it would be helpful just to acknowledge that when you come across this, don't freak out.
Right.
There's plenty of apparent contradictions in the Bible. The comforting thing is there's a way to resolve it. And we could talk about that at the end.
The problem here is that the resolutions are often such that a very slight change to the original text would have caused the contradiction to never even be an apparent contradiction to begin with, meaning that it would have been a completely trivial matter for God to have written that part of the book in such a way as to eliminate even the appearance of contradiction. But he decided not to for some reason. Mysterious ways, I guess.
But maybe what we could do is walk through some of the examples that maybe skeptics point out and show how we answer these apparent contradictions.
Taking bets now as to whether he actually gets to the ones pointed out by skeptics, or if he just sticks to the typical, this is how Judas died, this is how many women were at the tomb, etc. There's literally places where the Bible retells the exact same story and uses different numbers to describe things, like when 2 Chronicles 9:25 says that Solomon had 4,000 stalls for his horses, and 1 Kings 4:26 says that he had 40,000. Now, clearly a simple difference of one order of magnitude like this has an easy enough explanation as just being a scribe somewhere along the line adding an extra zero, and that scribe's manuscript became the most frequent copied version for that book. But the fact of the matter is that these are the 2 numbers that we see in our Bibles today, and they cannot both be simultaneously true. And this is not the only such error. There are many numerical errors like this.
The first one is Judas's death.
Yep, there we go. For the record, this is one of the apparent contradictions that, if God wanted to make it clear, it could have been fixed with the addition of just a couple of words to the version of the story in Acts. Instead of just saying, and falling headlong, it could say, and hanging himself, then falling headlong. Those 2 words, just hanging himself, would remove any doubt that the 2 stories could be reconciled. So now we're left with a new bit of information. I, a fallible, mortal, definitely non-God person, have just altered the Bible in a way that resulted in it being more clear without taking away any meaning or message. In other words, I improved it. I took a book that is supposed to be perfect, and with the addition of 2 words, I made it better. What does that say about the book's alleged perfection in the first place?
Well, you have, again, these 2 accounts, and you get somebody like a Bart Ehrman, the distinguished professor at Chapel Hill, North Carolina, so-called Christian turn agnostic.
Right.
Just love that little bit of condescension. Of course Ehrman wasn't a real Christian. No real Christians ever leave the faith, so he was just a so-called Christian. Never mind that the whole reason he went into the field of study that he did was so that he could have a better understanding of God's Word, and also understand exactly how we know what really was in God's Word, given the obvious errors that have come to us through competing manuscript traditions, and the fact that we know of several places where the scribes altered, both accidentally and intentionally, the text that they were copying. He began his academic journey on a mission to figure out what the original Word of God was, and how we know that that is what it was. And he ended up realizing that we really can never be certain that what we are reading in the Bible is actually what God intended to say. That whole thing right there can just be dismissed by referring to him as a so-called Christian. For the sake of brevity, I will now summarize the contradiction instead of letting them ramble about it. I've also got both stories highlighted in a nice little colored code to make it easier to see the 3 main problems we have with the story. For the blue highlighted portion, we have the question of who bought the field. In Matthew, Judas returns the silver to the priests, who then use the silver to buy the field. In Acts, Judas acquired the field himself with the reward of his wickedness. For the red highlighted portion, we have the cause of death. In Matthew, he went and hanged himself. In Acts, he fell headlong and burst open in the middle with all his bowels gushing out. The green highlighted portion explains why the field is known as the field of blood. In Matthew, it's because the field was purchased with blood money. It never even implies that Judas died in that particular field. In Acts, it's because that's the field where Judas died, and his death was a particularly gruesome and bloody one. Now, my earlier 2-word fix would fix the cause of death part of the verse, but to fix the rest, we'd have to do a bit more wordsmithing. Acts would be the easiest one to change, and is the one that gives the least amount of detail. So in this case, to fix all 3, I might change it to read, now a field was acquired with the reward of his wickedness. Traveling to the field, he hanged himself, and falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. And it became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their own language, Akeldama, that is, the field of blood. So there, I fixed the Bible for you, with some very minor modifications that still keep the meaning of the text intact. Now let's see how they fix it.
This is not an either-or situation.
Okay.
And so we need to resist that temptation of thinking, oh, well, this account's right and this account's wrong. Let's try to figure out which account is the right account.
Yeah.
I'm actually of the opinion that they are both wrong, and that if Judas was even based on an historical person, his death was, in reality, unknown. That certainly explains why there were at least 2 competing traditions with regards to the matter.
Instead, we want to give the scripture the benefit of the doubt.
Why, though? What has Scripture done to earn the benefit of the doubt? Why should we just assume that when we see an obvious contradiction, it must not actually be a contradiction? I mean, I guess it's just easy to dismiss every obvious contradiction if you don't have to think about it. You just start off with the assumption that if it looks like a contradiction, it can't possibly be, even if you yourself can't figure out how it could possibly not be. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it must actually be an alien spying on humanity in a duck costume.
The way that you reconcile this is that he did, after betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, what he did is he went out to the field of Akeldama, the field of blood, and he hung himself on a tree. But you got to imagine that this tree, that he would have went up on a tree over a branch, and the branch maybe would have suspended itself over a cliff.
Right.
And so after hanging himself, you can imagine the branch not being able to withstand Judas's weight.
Yeah.
And so what happens? The branch breaks, he falls off the cliff then with the branch, hits a rock, and he's disemboweled.
Well, credit where it's due. That's actually a better explanation than the whole his dead body hung there for a few days and became bloated in the sun such that when the rope snapped his body hit the ground and exploded reconciliation that we normally hear. I mean, it still leaves us with the problem of why this field is called the Field of Blood and who bought the field in the first place, and the one story doesn't even say that he went to this field to die, and most fields don't contain cliffs such that you can fall off of them and just, like, have your body disemboweled, but that is actually one of the best reconciliations I've heard for this story, which isn't really saying much if I'm honest.
Let's go on to another one about how Saul died. So in 1 Samuel 31, verses 1 through 6, we have one account of Saul's death. And in 2 Samuel 1, verses 4 through 10, we have a second account of Saul's death. So again, maybe you can kind of do the same thing, sketch out where the contradiction is, and then we'll talk about maybe another principle of how we can work these things out.
And once again, to save you the rambling, I'll explain it myself. In 1 Samuel, Saul is wounded by archers and asks his armor bearer to kill him in order to avoid being killed by people that still have foreskins, because that's just gross. His armor bearer then refused, so Saul kills himself by falling on his own sword, which was followed by the armor bearer killing himself as well. In 2 Samuel, an Amalekite happens to be near where Saul was and saw him leaning on his spear. Saul called out to him and asked the Amalekite to kill him, and he obliges and then reports the events to King David, who has him executed for confessing to killing the king, despite that being the king's last request. I haven't watched ahead yet, but I imagine the apologetic is going to be something along the lines of Saul having fallen on his sword but survived, and then he begs the Amalekite for death when he comes by a little while later, which then leaves us with the question, why is he okay with an uncircumcised Amalekite killing him but not an uncircumcised Philistine? And also, if Saul really was that desperate to die but still had enough strength left to be leaning on a spear, then surely he had enough strength left for a second try himself? And let's not forget that the armor bearer in 1 Samuel didn't kill himself until after he saw that Saul was dead. Weird that Saul would call out to a stranger rather than plead more with the guy who was so loyal to him that he kills himself once Saul is dead. I would put this one in the pile of, yeah, I guess it could work, but it makes more sense as two independent and contradictory stories than it does as a single cohesive narrative. But let's just wait and see what they say.
As a result of Saul falling on the sword and dying, it was suicide, but it's kind of like he was in agony and he knew the consequences. Well, when you shift over to 2 Samuel chapter 1, the Amalekite ends up taking credit for taking the life of Saul. So, he goes before David and says, man, I showed up and Saul was, morbidly injured. He asked me to take his life, so I went ahead and kind of ran him through.
Right.
Well, that didn't go well for him.
So your angle is to say that the Amalekite was lying in order to gain favor with David. I presume that you would argue that David's rivalry with Saul was well known, so this Amalekite was seeking a reward for killing David's enemy? And yeah, that could make sense, but in that case, the book isn't being clear. Nowhere does it say that the Amalekite was put to death for lying about killing Saul. It said that he was put to death for killing Saul and confessing to it himself. So if I were God, writing a book that I didn't want to even appear to have contradictions in it, I might insert a verse or two about how the Amalekite was lying and David knew it, either because God revealed it to him, or because he had another report from the field of battle that told of Saul's suicide, or some other method. The fact that this story doesn't even hint at the idea that the Amalekite might have been lying for personal gain makes it look like David believed his story and put him to death not for lying about killing Saul, but for actually killing Saul. So, once again, imperfect, mortal, fallible me was able to rewrite this portion of the perfect Word of God in order to make it better than it is in its current form. I am not an author by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know what I'm doing when it comes to writing anything other than scripts for my videos, and even then it's debatable. So, if I can do a better job than the all-powerful, infallible creator of the universe, then what does that say about the likelihood that this all-powerful, infallible creator of the universe actually exists? I'd say it makes it seem rather unlikely.
David, suspected something was fishy there, and he said, "You not fear God," basically.
No, he didn't say, "Do you not fear God?" He said, "You confess to having killed the king who was God's anointed one, so you are to be punished with death." Those are not the same thing.
And you can remember David wouldn't even touch Saul. Saul walked past him when he was running from him in a cave, and he cut off a piece of his garment. He could have injured Saul, but he didn't because he had such a reverence for the office.
Right.
In my opinion, this little aside was a skippable section of their video, but I left it in because it illustrates nicely how they like to sanitize the Bible. Saul wasn't walking past David in a cave. Saul was taking a massive shit in the cave that David was hiding in, and I guess it must have been one of those shits that's pretty painful because it distracted him enough that David was able to sneak up on him and cut off a piece of his robe without him noticing. David and his men then had what I guess would have been a whisper fight while Saul was still shitting about whether or not to kill him, which David eventually won, and then Saul left without washing his hands because God hadn't bothered to inform anyone about the existence of germs.
A lot of people are going to say things like, well, isn't the Bible without error? But then you just seem to have described in 2 Samuel there something that was false, something that was recorded that was false.
No. When people like me say that the Bible should be without error if it was actually written by God, what we don't mean is that it's without stories told in which the people in the stories were in error or lying about stuff. What it means is that it shouldn't even have one single verse that is in error, such as when we hear that Solomon has 4,000 horses in one verse and another verse says he has 40,000. That is an error, no matter how you slice it. Since that is an error, and it is present in the Bible is not inerrant.
Well, it's a good question, and it's the right question.
Not for this story, it's not. For this story, with the way you're reconciling the two, if it were indeed recounting a time when an Amalekite lied, nobody would argue that the Bible recording the lie of the Amalekite is the Bible telling lies. Well, not if it actually made it explicit that the Amalekite was lying at any rate. There are many, many errors in the Bible of all kinds, everything from simple spelling mistakes to glaring scientific inaccuracies. Addressing the errors here as if this is representative of the errors that we claim are in the Bible is basically just tackling a straw man. Rather than addressing something like Jesus calling the mustard seed the smallest of all seeds, you address something that's supposed to be the Bible accurately recording false words of a human, and then pretend that if that were an obvious fact about the story, then people like me would still claim that it's an error in the Bible, which we absolutely would not.
Now, first off, we're talking about the autographs, the autographa,
right.
Without error when we speak in that way.
He makes this distinction because he knows good and damn well that the Bibles that we have access to today are chock full of errors that are completely undeniable, and it doesn't take any more in-depth research than just reading the footnotes of most Bibles to see that. But that brings up an interesting question that I mentioned in my video on Monday. What about books like Galatians, which appear to have been dictated? Since the scribes that copied out the books of the Bible were obviously not inspired to do so inerrantly, since there's so many errors that they introduced to it, did that apply to the scribe taking dictation from Paul? Often with dictation, the person doing the dictating would give the broad strokes of what they wanted to get across, and allow the scribe to fill in the details. Did Paul do that? If so, what was inerrant, Paul's broad strokes or the scribe's filling in of details? And Galatia wasn't a single city with one single church in it, it was a region with multiple Christian congregations, so likely Paul sent letters to all the different churches there. Were they individualized letters of which only one survived? Which one survived? If the inerrancy was in Paul's words and not in the scribe's copying of his words, then how can we be sure that the copy of the letter that was actually divinely inspired was the copy that was preserved? There are a lot of unknowns here. I've only barely scratched the surface, and when push comes to shove, even if the original autographs were inerrant, the fact remains that we don't have access to a single one of the original autographs, and so the books that we are left with are, most definitely, not inerrant.
Okay, so let's move on to another one. How many thieves mocked Jesus on the cross?
Again, to avoid their rambling, I will summarize. In Matthew and Mark, it is made clear that 2 others were crucified with him, both of whom reviled him in the same way as the chief priests and the passers-by who mocked him. In Luke, it also specifies that 2 others were crucified with him, but only one of the 2 mocked him with the crowd. The second rebukes the first, commenting that they are criminals, they deserve their punishment, but Jesus did nothing wrong, and then there's that whole remember me when you come into your kingdom thing. John mentions the 2 others who were crucified with him, but as John was fond of doing, he modified the story to make Jesus more of a badass. Jesus was giving orders that people were obeying the whole time he was being crucified, so the idea that people could have been mocking him while he was ordering them around from the cross just didn't fit, so John left it out. So in all 4 Gospels, it is made very clear that there were exactly 2 others crucified with Jesus, and in Matthew and Mark, they both mock Jesus, while in Luke, only one mocks Jesus, while the other one rebukes the one who mocks.
I am the one who
mocks.
Well, I think it's accurately reporting what took place. Keep in mind, Jesus was on the cross from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. Now, can you imagine both of the thieves reviling Jesus, and then Jesus says, "Father, forgive them; they know not what they do." And this one thief has a heart change. Wait a second, we're sitting there blasting him. He's done nothing wrong. He's even asking for forgiveness, and so I think what took place is that his heart was softened. He recognized Jesus and he said, "Hey, teacher, remember me when you come into paradise."
So the fix is that he started off mocking Jesus and then repented? That seems like a pretty important detail to leave out of all 4 gospel accounts. A story about Jesus managing to convert a guy who was so dead set against him that he would be mocking Jesus even while being executed himself, who then comes to the realization that Jesus actually is the Son of God and so asks for forgiveness? That's a powerful story. And yet, in order to get that story, we have to hop in between books. Never is it laid out plainly. So, again, to improve on the Bible, Matthew or Mark should just have to add in 1 or 2 verses about the second criminal having a change of heart, and then giving the "remember me when you come into your kingdom" talk. Or Luke could have added a bit before that to indicate that both of the criminals mocked him at some point, instead of explicitly specifying that only one mocked him. I feel like attempting to harmonize the Gospels actually ends up missing the points that the various Gospel authors were attempting to make. After all, Luke had access to Mark. He copied word for word from it all throughout his book. If he wanted to make a point about the criminal on the cross converting, he would have copied the part about both criminals mocking Jesus before mentioning one who converted. But he didn't. He explicitly stated that only one of the criminals railed against him. He didn't leave room for interpretation here. He said one. So once again, we're left with a spot where the Bible could very easily have been written to be more clear, and so even if I grant your reconciliation requires an admission that the text is imperfect.
We have to understand that each of the gospel writers had a purpose, and they were trying to show the picture of Jesus that they sought to display. And to do that, it doesn't mean that they were obliged to go in chronological order.
Right.
Yeah, except the problem with this one isn't the chronology. It's the fact that none of the Gospels ever acknowledge even the possibility of a last-minute conversion for one of the criminals. They all either present both as mocking, or one as mocking and the other defending Jesus. Or in John's case, he just skips it. But yes, I would agree that the authors of the Gospels had different purposes in mind for their texts, and as such, they were not concerned with contradicting the other texts. They weren't planning on having all 4 of them read right next to each other, especially John.
Right. No, that's great. So let's move on to this next one. It is, do you answer the fool? Right. So here we go. We got this Proverbs 26 verses 4 and 5. It says, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." So we're not supposed to answer the fool. But then you have 1 Peter 3:15, the classic apologetic verse that says, be able to give a defense, be able to give an answer to the people that ask you. So are we supposed to answer the skeptic or not?
That was the most concise summary of anything that they've done so far. Thank fuck. I have skipped so much nonsense in this video that's just completely irrelevant to anything. Like, I know I have no business complaining about other people being less than concise. My videos could probably get their point across quicker than they do if I were to cut out some extraneous stuff. But most of the time when I go off on tangents or get bogged down in details, it's at least relevant to the main focus of the video. And in this one, I have skipped so much that just has nothing to do with anything. Anyway, the easy reconciliation for this one is to just not assume that all atheists are fools, but then that contradicts with Psalm 14:1, which says the fool says in his heart there is no God. But these guys are using a lot of terms here as though they are interchangeable. Notably, fool seems to be interchangeable with skeptic to them. And while a certain segment of the online atheist community has given the word skeptic a bit of a bad name recently, properly applied skepticism is pretty much the opposite of being a fool.
Well, the problem with the Proverbs passage is one verse it says, answer fool, another, don't answer fool.
Yeah, that was actually my main takeaway. Proverbs 26:4 seems more to directly contradict Proverbs 26:5, which, if read together, I would actually take to be a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of thing. In order to answer a fool, you have to stoop to their level, but to avoid answering makes them think they got the better of you with their foolishness. But really, I don't care about the reconciliation for this one because I don't even see it as contradictory in the first place, though I can definitely see how an argument could be made to that end. But there are many, much more obvious and irreconcilable contradictions that I'd rather focus on. And just for the record, his reconciliations let you just take it situationally, depending on the fool you're talking to, how things are going, what their disposition is, etc. You either answer them or you don't. Sure, I'll agree that that is a possible interpretation, and as a bonus, that one actually doesn't even result in more problems with the text than it solves, like his other solutions have.
Has anyone ever seen God? So we have Genesis 32:30. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." Sounds great. But then we have John 1:18 that says, "No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known."
Yep, the Bible waffles on whether or not God can be seen. Generally, the principle is that you can't see God's face and live. You can maybe see other parts of God or see God in a dream or vision and survive. That's probably thanks to the story of when God mooned Moses that one time, when Moses asked to see his face. The problem is, the Bible also definitively states that Moses did see his face and did not die. And there are a bunch of other places where other people saw God without dying, and a bunch of other places where it says that nobody has ever seen God and that nobody can see God. And sometimes there are nuances around these passages that I will allow and say that they don't really contradict, like when Jesus says that anyone who has seen him has seen the Father. That's metaphorical enough that I can grant that that doesn't actually count as seeing God, but there's also plenty that are unequivocally contradictory.
Well, no one has ever seen God's essential nature. That's the way that we resolve that, Tim. I mean, at the end of the day, Moses, for example, he got to see the backside of God while he was hidden in the cleft of the rock.
Yeah, but he also sat with him and spoke to him face to face, as one does with a friend, according to Exodus 33:11.
He's seen the face of God. This is God. Number one, God doesn't have a face.
Right.
Okay, because God is spirit.
Yeah.
So that's anthropomorphic language that's being used there.
No, the authors of Exodus definitely thought of God in physical terms. Dr. Joel Baden, professor of the Hebrew Bible at Yale, gave a talk that touched on some of how we know that on Monday. It should be up on the Yale Bible Study YouTube channel by the time this video goes up, so if I remember, I'll leave a link to it. But that aside, if face is used here to refer to the actual glory and nature of God in a metaphorical sense, while his butt is a toned-down version that it's possible to see and survive, then we're still left with Jacob having seen God's face in Genesis 32:30, and that one actually goes out of its way to point out that it's unusual for him to have seen God face to face and survive the encounter, suggesting that this was a full-blown God face. After Moses' death, Deuteronomy 34:10 makes the remark that there would never be another prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. There are other instances in the Bible, but the cases of Moses and Jacob are the most clear. They both saw God face to face in a way that contradicts verses like John 6:46, which point out fairly clearly that nobody has seen the Father except for he who is from God.
So maybe you can kind of put a big bow on this. Maybe give us just a few principles. We encounter something in Scripture. Somebody brings something up that we're just like, that seems pretty detrimental to to the Bible, and seems like there's a contradiction there. Review for us some of those principles that we need to keep in mind.
Okay. Number one, Tim, there are apparent contradictions in the Bible.
Ergo, the Bible is not perfect. To be perfect, it should avoid even the appearance of contradiction. If it's not perfect, then why would I have any reason to believe that it was given to us by God?
Number two, I'm not comfortable saying there are literal contradictions in the Bible.
You not being comfortable saying it doesn't change the fact that they exist. See my earlier example involving numerical errors that directly and irreconcilably contradict each other.
Number three, don't assume you're the first one to encounter the apparent contradiction.
I never have. In fact, I pretty much always assume that anytime I say anything, even remotely clever, I probably heard it from somewhere else first and just don't recall where. So rather than approaching contradictions as, "Gotcha, bet you've never heard this one before," I prefer to approach them from the perspective of which makes more sense, the idea that these conflicting verses were either a mistake or the result of multiple authors, or the reconciliation explanation. And usually, a simple mistake or being the result of multiple authors ends up being the explanation that requires way less in the way of mental gymnastics. So, did Judas hang himself, then fall to his death as the branch snapped off over a cliff, because fields so often have cliffs? Or were the two authors just independently writing down the stories that they were familiar with without necessarily even being aware of the other story? Well, given the complete lack of even the most basic hint that they were aware of each other, the idea that they were written by two independent authors who were unaware of each other seems more plausible to me than any of the potential reconciliations.
And then I'd say next, be aware of 3 or 4. So if somebody brings somebody up to you about how to answer them, if you don't know one, well, you can say some of the principles that I just shared.
Yeah, so if someone brings you an obvious and irreconcilable contradiction, such as the number of horses that Solomon had, you can rest safe in the assumption that because you know that there are some mental gymnastics that cover some of the other contradictions, there must be some that can cover this one as well, even if you can't figure it out yourself. So no need to worry or think about it, just trust that someone else has done your thinking for you.
And then the last thing that I would say is if somebody starts bringing up, oh, the Bible's just full of contradictions, ask the skeptic, well, can you point out one for me? Because a lot of times they're just broken records and they can't even point one out.
Try me. Go for it. Sure, maybe I'm not the average atheist. I necessarily spend a lot more time on this sort of thing than your average atheist does, but I would love for some poor aspiring apologist to smugly challenge me to point out one single contradiction, thinking that I'm more bark than bite. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Inoteshu1, who says, I disagree on your statement that Christians are everywhere in the USA. Your mainstream media sure as hell doesn't produce pro-Christian fiction. Rather the opposite. They are more likely to romanticize Muslims than Christians. And I really wonder why you call it Christianity in regards to the January 6th, but not in the case of Black American radicals. Few things here. First, 65% of the American population identify as Christian. Obviously, that will vary from region to region, but it's safe to say that they're still in the majority by a lot, though their lead is certainly shrinking. Second, I couldn't even find a list of Muslim-themed fiction films. I'm sure they exist, but, I've already spent way more time looking for Muslim-themed fiction based in the US than I usually spend on anything for the comment of the day. Maybe you just mean there's been an increase in Muslim characters and they aren't being portrayed as the goofy, bumbling idiots like they were pre-9/11, but rather just portrayed as normal people who happen to be Muslim, which is fine. Muslims exist in the real world, no reason to ignore their existence when making a movie. Not sure I'd count that as romanticizing them. Now, by contrast, it was really easy to find lists of Christian films which included many mainstream films with Christian themes. Not only were these lists really easy to find, but you can find them organized by year. They put out so many of them that there's always enough to fill out a top 10 Christian films of year X style list in every single year. And most, if not all of the films on these lists are American made. So to say that American media is more likely to romanticize Muslims than Christians is just flat out wrong. But they said mainstream media. So, like the movie Encanto, which, while avoiding getting specific about any particular religion, definitely had some very Catholic elements to it, and it's the second most popular movie of 2021. Or, say, Fox News, the #1 news network in the US, and not by a little bit either, by a lot, and it's basically fiction, so that one fits the criteria that's laid out, right? And last but not least, we have that gem of a comparison to the January 6th insurrection with Black American radicals, which I would assume is referring to the Black Lives Matter protests that are constantly being portrayed as riots. Well, I have no doubt that many who participated in the BLM protests identify as Christian, probably somewhere around 65% of them, in fact. Those protests were not overtly religious. I didn't see anyone carrying around giant crosses, didn't see any Jesus flags. I'm sure some of them were probably carrying Bibles, but you didn't see pictures of it. But also, the BLM protesters didn't break into any government buildings in an explicit attempt to overthrow the government, because let's be real, that's what the goal was on January 6th. They were trying to stop the steal, as they put it. In other words, stop Biden from becoming president and put Trump in that position. And since Biden was elected as president, that amounts to an overthrow of the government. The BLM protests, on the other hand, were fighting for civil rights. And as a nice little cherry on top, when researchers looked at data about all of the thousands of BLM protests, they found that 96.3% of them resulted in no property damage or police injuries, and 97.7% of them had no injuries among participants, bystanders, or the police. And when looking at the violent events, most were instigated by police or counter-protesters, not the BLM protesters. And on top of this, these numbers just assume that any looting that went on at the same time was because of the protests, even though there were many instances of looting and vandalism that were opportunistic in nature rather than actually being instigated by the protesters. So, yeah, I don't bring up Christianity's role in the BLM protests because Christianity typically finds itself on the wrong side of history for movements like that. Now, occasionally, some people on the right side of history are Christian, but Christianity isn't often the motivating factor for positive change. The events of January 6th, however, clearly had religious motivation behind them. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, iOS Tilt, Bill Gamer, Bryn Pound, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, and all the rest, who are the original autographs that prove the inerrancy of my channel. If you'd like to be completely unfalsifiable and used to explain away any mistakes I make, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!